Perfect. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining our session, Beyond Awareness, Sparking Behavior Change with Social Science. My name is Brielle Olshan. I'm the Director of Membership and Administration at the New Jersey Highlands Coalition. It is my great pleasure to introduce Jennifer Tabanico, President and owner of Action Research, a firm that specializes in changing behavior for the public good by applying marketing and social science research to outreach programs that promote safe, healthy, and sustainable communities. Jennifer has a Master of Arts degree in experimental psychology and more than 19 years of experience developing behavior change programs for public and private agencies, including 15 years of work on stormwater and watershed protection programs. Beyond this, she has authored or co-authored works in academic outlets, including the Journal of Environmental Psychology, Social Influence, and Social Marketing Quarterly. Most recently, she authored a book chapter on behavior change in the Handbook on Household Hazardous Waste, and she currently serves as an instructor for the University of California, San Diego Extension's Behavior Change and Sustainability Certificate Program. We'll have some time at the end of the session for a Q&A, so please write in your questions into the Q&A tab under our session, either during or after the presentation, and we will get to as many as possible. Again, please make sure you're writing to our session and not the entire event. And for any questions, use the Q&A, and for any comments, you're more than welcome to use the chat. Now I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see you here today, and thank you for having me. Again, my name is Jennifer Tabanico. At Action Research, I've dedicated the last 20 years almost to applying marketing and social science research to outreach programs that promote safe, healthy, and sustainable communities. So our product is behavior change. We don't sell anything other than that, and all of the behavior change that we work on contributes to the public good in some way. The vast majority of our work has been in the area of environment. We've worked across a broad range of waste and recycling programs, from curbside recycling to waste reduction, to now increasingly working on a collection of organics. We've worked in transportation, energy conservation, and efficiency. As you heard in the introduction, I've done quite a lot of work in the area of water quality and water conservation. It's actually one of my favorite areas to work in, based in Southern California. That's a huge part of our lives here, is the connection to the water. And then many other topics as well, agriculture, conservation, species conservation, human and wildlife interactions, you name it. You can drill it down to a behavior. We probably worked on it, or we're keen to do so. So not surprisingly, then, the first point I like to make in this presentation is that behavior matters. And so if you look at just about any environmental problem, whether it's water quality, air pollution, a particular measure of something in the water, even climate, we can really connect all of those environmental problems at some level to an individual's behavior or choice or habits. And so I like to say environmental problems are behavior problems. And one of the primary ways that environmental problems have typically been addressed has been through technology and infrastructure. And certainly there are ways to address many of our environmental problems in this way. So, we develop rain barrels and great designs for rain gardens, and we hope that everyone's going to put them in. But those technologies or those infrastructure elements are only as good as the people who use them. So for example, in the energy space, if you have a programmable thermostat, but you don't program that to an energy efficient setting, then you're not getting the benefit that that's intended for. Or if you've got a nice energy efficient home and the kids are leaving the windows open when the air conditioning's on, you're not getting that benefit. So even when there are technology and infrastructure solutions, much of the time we're still counting on human behavior to get the benefit out of that. Second way to approach environmental problems has been through policies and laws. And policies and laws can certainly impact environmental problems in meaningful ways. So for example, creating policies that take certain pesticides out of the market. or creating regulations around how much water can flow off of a property, or no water flowing off of a property. The challenge with policy and law is twofold. First, policies take quite a bit of time to get into place. There's a lot of process that needs to happen to get those in place, and a lot of public support involved in order to pass those policies. And then on the law side, the laws are great, and generally people will engage in behaviors if they to be in compliance with the law, but those laws are only good if they are able to be enforced. And so if there isn't good staff capacity or other resources to enforce those laws, then they're not as effective. And we're still relying on, at the end of the day, voluntary actions. With policy, very often the voluntary actions can buy us time before policies get into place. So they stop buying particular pesticides, for example. And once you get people engaged on a voluntary basis, when you have a majority engaged, then that helps to build support for passing those policies that will bring the others along. So not only does behavior matter, though, as it turns out, the behavior matters. So even just within this conference, or even just within people focused on water quality, there are a wide range of behaviors that could potentially be targeted. Different type of fertilizer use, pesticide use, litter prevention and management, management of animal waste. If you go erosion control measures, there's many, many different behaviors that are related to protecting water quality. And each of these behaviors have their own barriers associated with them. So just because somebody sees the value of water quality doesn't necessarily mean they're going to engage in all of these behaviors, because their behaviors we find, or the barriers we find, exist at the level of behaviors. So the reason someone might not apply a particular pesticide is different than the reason they might not follow the labels, which is different than the reason they might not pick up pet waste on their property. Or just because somebody recycles doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to participate in a litter cleanup. So because these barriers exist or it's important to recognize that those barriers exist at the level of those individual actions. So I want to talk next about how those of us in public education and marketing have gone about trying to change behaviors. And typically that's taken two different avenues. One has been a knowledge-based approach, and the other has been an awareness-based approach. Under the knowledge-based approach, the assumption is that if people don't act because they don't know what to do, or they don't know what they should. So we educate people through flyers and workshops and websites and brochures and door hangers and outreach events, with the hope that if people just knew what to do and we could just raise their knowledge enough, they will do it. Unfortunately, the research is very clear in showing that simply having knowledge about how to do something, or that you should do something, doesn't translate to behavior change in many cases, because knowledge by itself is not a motivation to act. The second approach is the awareness approach. Under this model, the emphasis is on highlighting the severity of the problem. If we can just get people to care enough, if we can just get them to see how much our shorelines are eroding, if we can just get them to see all of this trash that's accumulated, then certainly they will have such a positive attitude about the need to make a difference that they will engage in the action. But again, research shows, and study after study shows, that simply having a favorable attitude towards something does not necessarily result in behavior change, because knowledge and attitudes are just two of the barriers to behavior change. So I'm going to show you a couple examples. This first example I like to show because it's really probably the most intense thing you'd ever be able to do with your program. This was a study done in the 80s by a gentleman named Scott Geller at Virginia Tech, and he wanted to test whether changing knowledge and awareness could increase energy conservation. So he conducted a series of workshops. These were held on a weekend. It was a 3-hour workshop, and it was advertised in the paper. The workshop was only available to the first 40 people who signed up. So as you can imagine, the people who made it to this workshop were highly motivated to do something about energy conservation in their homes. They are willing to come out, spend a couple hours. They were the first ones to sign up. Very often in our programs, we're not necessarily dealing with the crowd that's running to us. We're seeking them out. So this is sort of like best case scenario. So Scott Geller conducted the energy conservation workshops, and in the workshops, they learned about things they could do in their home to save energy, mostly low or no cost activities. And he measured attitudes and knowledge before and after the workshop. And what he found was that participants after the workshop had much more favorable attitudes about energy conservation and were more knowledgeable about the things that they could do in their home to save energy. But they also measured behavior change. So this is going back to all of these individuals who participated in the workshop. And here's what they learned. Only one of the 40 highly motivated people who came to the workshop lowered the hot water temperature on their hot water heater. This is a relatively simple action, just a turn of a dial in most cases. And they were shown how to do this in the workshop. So even then, just one person did that. Slightly more impressive is that 2 out of the 40 installed a wrap around their hot water heater. And this was something that was far more intense. They would have had to go buy the wrap, get the right size, and actually install it, or have a contractor do that. So that's a great action because it prevents a lot of heat loss from the water heater, but only 2 people did that. And that's less impressive when I tell you that both of those people had actually reported doing that just before the workshop. So they were going to do it anyway. Lastly, 8 out of 40 installed a low flow shower head. And this is another great action in terms of energy conservation because it not only saves energy associated with water heating, but it also reduces water use. And 8 out of 40 did that. Very impressive finding until I tell you that all 40 of those highly motivated individuals who came and spent hours learning about energy conservation, all 40 of them had been given a low flow shower head at the workshop. So even though they had positive attitudes, increased knowledge, and the devices, it still didn't result in behavior change. More common, what we see, and very often we say, well, that was just one workshop. If we really hit them hard, we really, get the message out there, then certainly they will change their behavior. And so studies in this space, there's many different campaigns. Here's an example of one. This was the 5-A-Day campaign, which was a national health campaign sponsored by the National Cancer Institute. It started around 1991, and it was focused on getting the public to eat 5 servings a day of fruits and vegetables. And so can't see your hands here, but if we were to raise our hands, probably I would guess the majority of you in this room have heard about the 5-A-Day program, and you know what that means. So they tested the impact of the campaign, first looking at knowledge. So surveys conducted in the years prior to the campaign found that only about 7% of the population knew that they should be eating 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. That went up to 20% in the years after the campaign, which is a huge increase in terms of what you would detect on public surveys. But they also looked at consumption. In the years prior to the campaign, about 11% of people reported eating the recommended servings of fruits and vegetables per day. And in the years following the campaign, that stayed at 11%. And more following evidence suggested that that was actually going down. So despite having millions of dollars for broad advertising to get the message and the brand out there, there still was not a measurable decrease or increase in people engaging in the behavior. So why is that? When we look at environmental behaviors in particular, it's very different than the tactics that you would use in marketing. So when marketing, we're trying to get someone who drinks soda to drink one type of soda over the other, or to eat their cheeseburgers from McDonald's instead of Burger King, or to buy a Ford instead of a Chevy. But a lot of the behaviors that we're asking people to do are more difficult or more costly or more inconvenient than the alternative. So we're not just shifting a consumer preference. Very often we're developing new habits or breaking old ones. We're not trying to shift someone from a Ford to a Chevy. We're trying to get them to not drive at all, for example. And so that takes a different approach. And that approach, which I'll spend the rest of the time talking about today, is community-based social marketing. Community-based social marketing has been around about 30 years. It has become a buzzword in some spaces, but it's not a marketing tactic. It's not sort of the latest trend in marketing. Rather, it's a process, and it's a process that's grounded in decades of research in the social and behavioral sciences. So it draws from psychology and sociology and economics and other fields in understanding what motivates people to engage in different actions. Community-based social marketing is also, not surprisingly, community-based. That is, the programs that are developed based on information gathered from the communities in which they're delivered. And they very often make use of community channels of getting out information. So very much on the ground in the community, and rely on peer influences within the community. So local norms and also social diffusion, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation. Another really important element of community-based social marketing is that it focuses on removing barriers. So their barriers, as I mentioned, exist at the level of different behaviors, and knowledge can be a barrier, but there may be other barriers that get in the way of action. So a perception that I might be perceived as weird if I do this behavior. I don't have access to the right infrastructure to do the behavior, and many other types of barriers. And then lastly, community-based social marketing is behavior-based. It's focused on behavior at the outset, and we're more focused on outcomes, and particular, what are those water-based outcomes or environmental outcomes that we're hoping to change, rather than focusing on outputs, which is how many people did we reach, how many things did we do. Those are still interesting, and we count them for tracking purposes, but we're mostly interested in, did behavior change? So community-based social marketing is a 5-step process that begins with selecting a behavior. And that's a strategic process that I'll introduce you to briefly in this presentation. Once you've identified a behavior, we then conduct audience research to identify the barriers that decrease the likelihood that people will engage in the behavior and the benefits that will increase the likelihood that they engage in the behavior. Only when we have that information then do we move to the 3rd step, which is developing strategies. And those strategies are oriented around decreasing barriers, highlighting benefits, as well as leveraging information from the social and behavioral sciences. Once we've developed a strategy, or maybe a couple of different variations of a strategy, those strategies are then pilot tested on a small scale for a short time to determine if they're effective and also cost effective before they're implemented broadly. And then, of course, we would continue to evaluate. So it's a 5-step process. So I thought at this point, it might be helpful to walk you through a simple case study of what that process looks like in practice. So this was some work I did several years ago for the City of Oceanside's Clean Water Program. The City of Oceanside is in San Diego County in Southern California. It's the northernmost city in San Diego County. And we were approached by the Clean Water Program to address a water quality issue along the San Luis Rey River. And in particular, they were focused on bacteria. And so there is a trail called the San Luis Rey River Trail that runs 7 miles from inland all the way to the Pacific Ocean, right along the San Luis Rey River. On one side, it's paved for biking and walking, and the other side is not as much infrastructure. It was dirt most of the way. And we learned from the city that one of the primary contributors to the bacteria in that water was likely pet waste. And I'm sure there are many other contributors, but pet waste was one they felt that they could target. So before we just developed a campaign around pet waste, we first wanted to make sure that we had the right behavior. And so that's step 1, behavior selection. We want to make sure is the behavior that we're going to focus on linked to the problem? And who is engaged in that behavior that's linked to the problem? So those were the 2 first questions we wanted to answer. So we sent out actually a group of Girl Scouts to help us with that. And they identified, and certainly there was plenty of pet waste out there along the trail. And they did that by conducting observations and actually counting piles along the trail. Second, we wanted to know who is responsible for that pet waste left along the trail. Is it dog owners that are coming from all over the city, all over San Diego, or just kind of close to the trail? So the Girl Scouts intercepted people who are out there with their dogs and asked them for their cross streets. And we learned that the vast majority of people coming to the trail with their dogs were coming from the streets immediately adjacent to the access points of the trail. So we know what our problem is, and now we know who is linked to the problem. And that gives us direction on our next step, and that is getting information from the audience. So step 2 is to identify the barriers and benefits to picking up pet waste along the trail, picking up after pets. And when we first started, the city felt, well, we probably don't need to do that. We already know why people don't pick up. They don't care. They don't understand that it's linked to water quality. If they just knew that it was the law, like they're not supposed to do it, it's against the law. And if we catch them, technically, we could fine them. If they just knew all of these things, they would do that. And you can see that reflected in the signs that really just put all of the information. Dog waste transmits disease, it contaminates drinking water. They have images that make picking up after your pet not look very comfortable. Those figures are kind of hunched over. The one on the green doesn't even actually have anything to pick up after. So, but these were pretty typical of what we saw on the trail across the city and actually quite a lot of places across the country. But we didn't want to make assumptions about that. We wanted to learn what are the barriers and benefits for our target audience. And so since we knew the streets that they lived on, we chose to go with a mail survey. And we had over 50% of the residents that we mailed it to respond. And we learned that people weren't really concerned about pet waste transmitting disease. They didn't believe that it was something that would ever be enforced. They weren't motivated by the fact that it was the law. But what they were motivated by was a sense of social responsibility. So if you have a dog, this is a responsibility. It's a responsibility to pick up. So that was a primary motivator. But then in terms of barriers, we learned that if people didn't pick up after their pets, the primary reason was that the trash cans were too far away or that they did not bring a bag with them. So knowing those things, knowing what's important to our audience and what was preventing them from picking up, it made it really easy for us to develop a strategy. So the strategy highlighted audience motivations of social responsibility, the scoop, the poop, and it also highlighted a co-benefit, which was preventing water pollution. So that in that way, it was a secondary benefit that was mentioned in the surveys. But importantly, just putting the sign up was not enough. We also needed to address the barriers. So that included putting up trash cans and pet waste bag dispensers along the trail. Before that was done all over the trail, it was really important to test that because that's a lot of infrastructure to invest in, and we want to make sure it was going to work. So we divided the trail into sections, control sections, which just kept the existing signage and infrastructure, and then the community-based social marketing sections where we installed the new infrastructure. And we went back out and counted piles again and saw a 23% reduction immediately in piles of pet waste accumulating along the trails compared to a control area where there was none. So if this was just a change in fewer dogs going out or seasonal, maybe it's rainy and not as many people are out and about on the trail, then we should have seen a reduction on both the community-based social marketing pilot and the control. So having that control group really helped us be sure that it was our infrastructure and our strategy that resulted in that reduction. So just a quick anecdote, a few years after that program was in place, I got a call from a woman at the Clean Water Program, and she told me, hey, I don't think the signs are working anymore because we've expanded them across the trail, and now we're finding bags of pet waste all along the trail. So I think we need a different message. And so I inquired a little bit deeper about it. And I said, well, did you put the signs up and the bag dispensers or in the trash cans, or tell me kind of what you did? She said, well, we couldn't get the trash cans to get emptied. So we just put the bag dispensers and the signs. And I said, oh, so they addressed the barrier of not having the bag and they got the motivation. They got people motivated to pick up, but they didn't have the infrastructure, that other barrier of people taking that last step of putting it in the trash. So without the trash cans, they were just leaving it along the trail. So kind of anecdotal, we didn't test that, but I suspect it was because not all of the barriers were addressed. So next I want to walk through each of these steps in a little bit more detail and just talk to you a little bit more about how these play out. So first is selecting a behavior. I mentioned that this is a strategic selection. A lot of times when we work with clients, they'll say, we want to do a program on, I don't know, turning off the lights. And you say, well, why do you want to do that? Well, it seems interesting, or we have like a good idea for a tagline, or I see it a lot in my neighborhood. And so at this point, we want to really be testing our assumptions and making sure that the behaviors that we select are first linked to the outcome. So if you pick a behavior that's not linked to the outcome you're trying to change, you won't see change at the end, even if you change the behavior. So that's really important to define the outcome and make sure you identify behaviors that are listed with that. Second is to identify the sectors or targets that are most associated with that outcome. So if you're looking at litter, for example, is that coming from the roadways, so blowing off of trucks, or is it people throwing trash out onto the street? Is it trail users, or is it road users, for example? Or is it, if you're looking at maybe pesticide in the waterways or some other material, you might look at, well, is that coming from the residential area? Is it coming from agriculture? Is it coming from commercial? Who has the biggest impact on the problem? And then we kind of start there to figure out what are those behaviors they're engaging in. So once you've identified your outcome and the primary sectors or targets that are associated with that, next you want to list all of the things, all of the behaviors that are relevant to that behavior. No matter how big, no matter how small, it all goes on the table then. And then we go through some efforts to prioritize them. And we do that by evaluating each of the behaviors on the list across 4 different dimensions. First is impact. We want to pick behaviors that have a high impact on the outcome that we're trying to change. However, we also want to look at probability. That is, how likely is it that we can get people to engage in the behavior? Some behaviors may have a high impact, but there's really low likelihood that we'll get people to engage in it. So we want high impact, but we also want a high degree of probability. Third, we look at penetration. That is, how many people are already engaged in the behavior. We want behaviors that have low rates of penetration. So if everybody in the neighborhood already has a rain barrel, then delivering a rain barrel program just for the last few probably isn't going to get you any big change in your outcome. So we want behaviors that have high impact, high probability, but low levels of involvement or low levels of penetration, because we want some room to move. And then lastly, we want behaviors that have a broad applicability. So is this something, if you've got a neighborhood, it's all primarily renters, and you want them to put in a rain garden, that is not going to be applicable to the vast majority of your neighborhood. So looking at applicability is important as well. And so when we're making decisions about what behaviors to focus on in the program, we're looking for those that have the best combination of those 4 factors. And you might ask, well, why can't we just do everything? There's a couple of reasons for that. One, it's unlikely that you'll be able to overcome the barriers to all of those different behaviors. But more importantly, when people are faced with too many choices about what they can do, they simply get overwhelmed, and research suggests that they're likely to do nothing. So if you give people, here's 100 things you can do to protect the Delaware River, they'll either do nothing, or they're going to pick those things that are maybe not that impactful, or that they could really easily do without much effort. So in developing programs, this is a really important step to engage in. The other element of behavior selection that I want to point out is the idea of a behavior chain. And this is that what we very frequently refer to as a behavior is often made up of a variety of sub-actions, each of which have their own set of barriers associated with them. So if you think of a behavior like planting a tree, that sounds simple, but it actually breaks down into lots and lots of different behaviors. First, you have to get people motivated to want to plant the tree. Then they have to figure out where they want to plant it. They have to determine what type of tree. You may not want just any tree, because you certainly don't want to invite anything invasive. They may need to check the soil quality, contact their utility, obtain the tree. That might mean ordering it and having it delivered. It might mean going to get it, and so on, through digging the hole, planting the tree, all the way through to those regular behaviors like mulching and pruning and weeding that need to happen on a regular basis in order for that tree to take hold. So we've taken this really simple behavior, and now it's gotten really more complex. The important thing about this is that when you map out these behaviors, you realize that there are barriers all along the way. So if, you might have people that are super motivated to plant a tree, but the trees that they want are not available. So you have a barrier there. Or they see the trees and they can access the trees they want, but they can't get it home. Or maybe they don't have the physical ability to actually plant the tree. So when you break this down, you can kind of identify where some of those barriers might be and address them in the program. So the second step, once you've identified a barrier or behavior and you've broken down those chains, is to understand from the audience what are the barriers that decrease the likelihood of action and what are the benefits that increase the likelihood of action. And barriers can be internal or external to the individual. Internal barriers might just be apathy. I don't feel like it. I don't think this is important. It might be perceptions about norms. Oh, I don't want to be weird. I don't know what my neighbors are going to think. But they could also be external barriers. So if you want people to take used oil or paint products to a household hazardous waste facility, and that facility is only open 9 to 5 during the week, that's a barrier for people who are maybe working regular jobs. So there could be things that are elements of the program that people don't have control over, distance, for example, that also need to be addressed. In identifying benefits, there's important distinction between the audience motivation and the program purpose. So what we're most interested in here is, what does the audience see as beneficial about engaging in the behavior? A lot of times this is different than the reason for doing the program. Your reason for doing the program might be to prevent erosion or to, say, prevent bacteria in the waterway. But the audience motivation might be, I want my yard to look nice. I don't want my yard to be kind of so squishy when I walk through it after the rain. There may be other motivations that the audience has, and it's really important that we not only identify those, but present the program to them in terms of what is motivating to them. Another important thing to acknowledge here is that I mentioned that barriers are behavior specific, but barriers can also vary by audience. So older audiences may experience more challenges to some behaviors than younger. Those with families might experience different types of barriers. Barriers can vary by season. Going out and maintaining your rain garden during one time of the year might be a lot easier than other times of the year. And barriers can change over time as new products come into the market. That may introduce new barriers, or policies change, politics change. So important to kind of keep that in mind. When doing barrier and benefit research, we typically start out with a literature review. Let's see what other people are doing already. And then other qualitative work like observations, so kind of looking to see what other people are doing and what challenges they're coming across. Do they have rain barrels outside, but they're not connected correctly? Do they have, are you at a park and you see trash blowing out of the trash cans? That might suggest there's barriers around the infrastructure. We can also do focus groups and get a broad sense for what of all the things that people experience. Typically then, those get rolled into more quantitative surveys that can tell you how much each of these are barriers. But I know a lot of our environmental organizations are often short on time or budget. So at a very minimum, we always want to be doing literature reviews. So looking to what others have done to give us a sense for what barriers come up. And we can do intercept surveys. So that is just going out into the public where people are congregating and asking at least 2 core questions. And first is, what makes it difficult for you to engage in the behavior? And second, what would you perceive to be beneficial about engaging in the behavior? Just with those 2 core questions alone, we're leaps and bounds ahead of just basing our programs on a hunch. The problem when we do that is we are developing programs that might work for us as people who are invested in these topics. And when we do that, we're ignoring sort of the needs of our target audience. And so it's really important, even if you can't get, if you don't have resources to get all the information, to at least get some information about the target audience. So a lot of work done up front, but then from here on out, the process actually goes pretty quick because you have all of the information that you need. You know what the barriers are, you know what to highlight, and so developing strategy becomes pretty straightforward. So I'll spend the rest of the presentation on that. With community-based social marketing, the strategy has 4 basic components. First, we want to enhance motivation. If people don't have any drive to do the action, the barriers don't matter because they're not even at the table. So that's primary. So motivation is most important. And then we also need to address barriers as well. So if you think of the right side of the screen as where you want to go with your behavior change, and look at this figure, the wavy lines represent motivation. So your audience is kind of moving along toward the behavior, and they hit this wall of barriers. So got to have the motivation, the wavy lines, but then they hit the barriers. So one thing you could do here is take down the barrier wall so that their existing level of motivation sails right over. Or you could enhance their motivation so high that they want to do it so badly that the barriers don't matter. The best combination, though, is to do both with our programs. We want to simultaneously address as many barriers as we can. Very rarely can we address all of them. So we want to address the biggest barriers, and then at the same time also increase benefits or motivation. And that's what's going to get us most effectively to our behavior change goals. Third, we emphasize personal contact. And so typical programs that include a lot of mass media, billboards, TV, radio, those are great for getting information and awareness out there. You can reach a lot of people, but the behavior change associated with that is typically very low compared to the other end of that spectrum, which would be talking to people one-on-one, knocking on doors, using block leaders, talking to people at events, holding workshops. Those, you don't reach as many people, but the behavior change associated that is far greater. So if you think about maybe the last book you read or the last podcast you downloaded, did you hear a trailer? Did you see an ad? Or did somebody else in your social group kind of tell you about that? Was that one-on-one interaction? Those one-on-one interactions could be virtual now. I know there's a lot of places to do that. There's also different degrees. So providing people personalized information or personalized feedback about their activity is still closer to personal contact than this mass media approaches. The last part, this is the fun part, is we engage tools from the social sciences to address particular barrier or motivation challenges. So there's lots and lots of tools. We could talk for 3 straight days about all of the different tools available to us, but I'm going to talk about the 6 most common. The first 3 are focused on removing barriers. So that's education, convenience, and prompts. Education is typically used, even though I said, well, knowledge is not enough. That's true. Knowledge is not a motivation, but it can be a barrier. So typically we use education components when knowledge is a barrier. They don't know how to do it. They don't know the steps. They don't know that it's important to do. It's also used when you have a new program or a behavior, maybe a new material is being accepted or not accepted at a household hazardous waste facility, or if there's a change to the program or behavior. So we've all seen these. If you want people to remove an invasive species, well, they may need to know, what are those invasive species? How do I recognize them? That would be a knowledge barrier. And what are the steps that I need to engage in to remove them? This is another example, steps for maintaining a particular stormwater best management practice on their property. So providing people with information. But of course, that only gets over one barrier. There may be other challenges to engaging in those. The second tool that's focused at removing barriers is convenience. Anytime you can make a behavior easier for people to do, you increase the likelihood that people will engage in it. So we want to make the desired behavior easier. But whenever possible, we also want to make the undesired behavior harder. So if you want people to sort through their recycling and put things in the compost and things in the recycle, and you're hoping that very limited amount goes in the trash, then you make the trash cans smaller, right? Because you're making it harder for them to just throw everything in the trash. The other way to make things convenient is by reducing the steps. So thinking back to the tree planting example, you could make that behavior a lot easier, where when somebody has an intention to plant the tree, they call the program, somebody comes out and they help them find a site, they help them choose a tree, they make contact with the utility, and then maybe they have the tree delivered and put it in the ground. You can take all of those steps out of that process by making it more convenient. You can do a lot of different behaviors where that's the case. So this was an example of convenience. We were addressing the forgetting a bag and making it more convenient for them to dispose. Conveniently placed trash cans. So research by Keep America Beautiful and others suggests that about About 30 feet, roughly, across different studies, is about how far people will typically walk to a trash can. Beyond that, the likelihood of litter increases. So conveniently placed infrastructure for trash is another example. And this is an example out of New Zealand where they're trying to decrease instances of Cori dieback disease, which comes from transporting a fungus. So rather than relying on people bringing brushes and materials to the trail to clean their boots, they provide a boot cleaning station where they can just clean their boots before and after hiking. So the last tool that I'll present around removing barriers is prompts. Prompts are visual or auditory reminders. And so they are signs, stickers, maybe text messages that remind you to engage in the behavior. And therefore, they're primarily used when the barrier is forgetting. They're best for repetitive actions, things that you do regularly, because the idea is we're going to remind you to do this a few times, and eventually then you're going to get it. It's going to become habit. Prompts are also typically placed close in space and time to where the behavior will occur. So if you want people to sort things in the correct bins, then the stickers go on the bins. And they emphasize the correct action, what to do rather than what not to do. So here's a couple examples. Here's an example of a prompt reminding owners of large properties to pick up after their dogs in areas that are highly susceptible to runoff, such as those that don't have vegetation or that are close to creeks or culverts. This is a prompt that reminded people to check their sprinklers check for broken and misaligned sprinklers at the time that they're mowing their lawn. So we're linking it to something they're already doing and reminding them to engage in that behavior. And this really came about is because we found out that people were watering their lawns very early in the morning. And so they were missing. They didn't know that things were broken or misaligned and pouring water down into the street. Lots of different possibilities for using prompts as well with text-based messaging or geofencing. There's some really new technologies coming out around that. So the last three tools I'll cover then are around enhancing motivation: commitment, social diffusion, and social norms. Commitments are based on self-perception theory, and that is when you make a commitment to do something, if you tell somebody you're going to do something or you tell somebody that something is important to you, it changes the way you see yourself, and your future actions are likely to be aligned with that. So people like to be perceived as consistent with their values, but also consistent with their previous behavior or what they said that they were going to do. So that consistency is really seen as an important character trait in society. And so there's that motivation to want to keep those things in line. Because it relies on that initial commitment, somebody telling you they're going to do something, commitments tend to work best for an audience that is already motivated to engage in the behavior, but for whatever other reason, they haven't engaged in it yet. They haven't done the behavior. Commitments are strongest when they are written, so a signed pledge versus made verbally. When they are public, so if those pledges are posted somewhere publicly. And lastly, if they're durable, that public commitment stays up there. It doesn't just sort of flash up on social media for a day and then it's gone, but it's there. You know, every time you walk into the workplace, there's your commitment posted there right on the inside. Those from research has kind of looked across all of the commitment studies. Those are sort of the three conditions that enhance the likelihood that a commitment will be effective. So here's an example of a program that was aimed at getting municipal employees to turn off their computers at the end of the day. This was a commitment that was signed and then placed on the lower left-hand corner of their computer monitor, where it also served as a reminder. Here's from Oregon Coast Aquarium's commitments to spending time outdoors. So it's stating specifically what they were going to do. Commitments, this is a pledge getting people to recycle used oil and filters. These were placed up in the store, but then also placed around a funnel so that people had a reminder of their commitment home with them when they were changing their oil the next time. Here's an example of grouped commitments around picking up after pets. So another way that we can enhance motivation, particularly if the behavior is new, is through social diffusion. So think about that person in your network that is always the one to get the first iPhone or whatever the newest technology is. There's usually someone in there that gets that first and then kind of talks to their friends, families, colleagues about that. And now suddenly everybody else is doing it. Stated pretty simply, that's social diffusion. Social diffusion works best for visible behaviors because it relies on people talking to one another about their experience. So, oh, you can see somebody wearing an iPhone, an Apple Watch, or using an iPhone, but you can also see somebody putting in a rain garden or a rain barrel. Not all behaviors are visible, but social diffusion works really well for those that are, and really well for behaviors that are new, because you can't necessarily rely on other drivers in society. So the way this works is to gain commitments from an early adopter, someone who's willing to try it first. And those are typically people who are well known and well respected. They need to be well respected because we're asking them to talk to others about their engagement in that behavior. But they also need to be well known so that they know a lot of people and can reach across a lot of different networks. So this has been used to spark engagement in new agricultural practices. So getting that early adopter farm to try the technology first. So this was a soil amendment that actually came from a fossil fuel plant. It was a flue gas desulfurization gypsum, which is basically just like mined gypsum, but it was a byproduct of cleaning fossil fuel stacks. And the way this worked was that there was a farm that was willing to try it on a small portion of their land, report back on the results that they got from various crops, and talk with other farmers in the community about it. The last tool is social norms. And social norms are probably my favorite tool. They're probably one of the strongest tools that we have in our toolbox, and they can be very powerful. So essentially what social norms are is that people, when they're not sure, particularly when they're not sure what to do, look to the behavior of others and the opinions of others to determine their course of action. So, I mean, right now there's so many examples of social norms. If you walk into a store, should I wear my mask here? Should I not? We tend to look to see what other people are doing to determine what would be a right choice for our own behavior. There's two different types of norm. One is descriptive norms. That's what other people do. And then the second is injunctive norms. That is what other people approve of doing. Those aren't always aligned. So in general, most people disapprove of litter, but in some places there's a strong descriptive norm for, oh, other people litter here. So sometimes those two things are not aligned, and it's important to recognize both. Because norms are so powerful at guiding behavior, they can be used when motivation is low. So they can really be used to pull along those people who might not otherwise be, making commitments to do it. Also, because they're so powerful, it's really important to highlight the desired behaviors. So if we highlight that, oh, everybody else is littering here, that suggests that, well, that's just what we do here. So really we want to be highlighting that people that are doing the right thing, or the vast majority of people doing the right thing. So I'll show you a couple examples. This is a way that you can convey social norms by grouping commitments together. So these are all the people that committed to recycling used oil and filters. So it conveys, well, other people think this is important as well. And you can do it through messaging. Hopefully you can see this on your screen, but you can pull from survey data or observational data, any data you have, to convey positive social norms. So here, for example, 90% of US adults who believe recycling is at least somewhat important and that we should do what we can to recycle. 82% report that most or some homes in their neighborhood set out their recycling for collection. So this is conveying other people approve of this and other people are doing of this. And so therefore, complying with that or going and engaging in this behavior is likely a right choice. You can also compare another way is through normative feedback by giving people information about what they're doing compared to others. So this has been done quite a bit in the water and energy use. So presenting, and you may have seen this on your electric or gas or water bills, where they show kind of what you're using compared to others in your community. So you can see in this particular example, this person's using more than their neighbors. And so what the research shows around this is that if people who are using more than their neighbors and they're presented with information about that, they will decrease their use to become more in line with the norm. And because of that influence of even just a small graph could have, again, we want to make sure that we're highlighting the positive things. So images that show everybody doing the wrong thing intuitively might seem like, oh, this is going to get everyone to act, but most of the time does not result in behavior that's opposite to what you're trying to convey. So just about 2 more minutes before we wrap up, even if you've done great research and picked the best behavior, if your strategy does not capture people's attention and all of the mix of other behaviors and programs that are out there, then you likely won't get behavior change. So we can't ignore communication. And what we know about communication is that capturing attention is critical. And 4 ways you can do that. There's lots of ways. First, if the information is personalized, if it's vivid, if it focuses on local impacts, and it emphasizes values that are important to the audience. So here's an example of using vivid imagery. This is around using insulation. It talks about how if you add up cracks around under the doors, you have the equivalent, the hole the size of a football in your living room wall. So vivid language like that. Or making comparisons to tangible things. So here they're talking about 396 million tons of manure. Well, that doesn't mean very much. But then when you say that's enough to fill the Empire State Building every single day, that then really captures attention. And also tying it to local impacts, local wildlife, local landmarks, things that are important to the audience. And lastly, audience values. And just to reiterate again, the reason for delivering the program doesn't always align with the audience's reason for engaging in the behavior. So for this program, the primary motivation for the program was water quality, but the primary reason people with large properties would keep their yards free of pet waste is so they can enjoy their yards and not have to step in it. That was what was most motivating for them. So the 4th step then is to pilot test the strategies. Without a lecture on research methods, we'll just touch on that briefly. And the primary reason for pilot testing is to identify and address problems. It also allows you to test different variations. You could have one community gets door-to-door outreach and another one just gets maybe something in the mail. And by testing different program variations, you're not only able to say, did behavior change, but how can we change behavior for the least cost? So you want to find the most cost-effective program so that you can scale it up more broadly. With that pilot testing information allows you to then go back and refine your strategy and keep pilot testing until it's effective before it's rolled out across the community. Sometimes at that pilot testing stage, you might say, we've tried everything, there's just barriers we can't overcome, and you would have to go back and select a different behavior. Doesn't happen very often if you've done your homework around selecting behaviors, but it is built in that feedback loop. All right, so we're going to turn it over to questions for the last 10 minutes or so. I'm going to leave this slide, which is just some additional resources when you access the slides or recording that you can look into to learn more about community-based social marketing.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was wonderful. We do have a couple of questions. And everybody, please do continue to add in your questions into the Q&A section for our session. From Dana, for the energy savings workshop, what narratives were used to motivate behavior change? So for instance, for the low flow shower head, was it saving water or was it saving money?
Yeah, so I'm not really sure in that particular instance, the content of the workshop. That was sort of an academic study. However, around a lot of conservation behaviors, the tendency is to want to focus on money savings. The challenge with that is that it's very extrinsic motivator. So if you get people engaged for saving money, and then that money savings goes away, which it often does, particularly if you have tiered pricing or water prices that are fluctuating always, and they're doing all these things and they're not getting that benefit, then you've completely undermined the program. So whenever possible in our programs, we're really trying to emphasize intrinsic motivations. Something that people tend to be very motivated around is loss. People are loss averse. So if you highlight what they're wasting by not engaging in the behavior, that is actually more motivating than what they might lose by engaging in the behavior or by not engaging in the behavior. The money that they would save. Better to focus on the money that they would lose if they don't do it rather than on money they would save, as well as other intrinsic motivations. So just avoiding waste. People generally don't want to be perceived as wasteful. We see that across a lot of different behaviors, from energy to water use and even food. So typically we're learning more and more about that, and newer programs are focusing on that as well. The money savings is also implied, they found, and when you throw multiple motivators in there, it tends to counter your message if you throw in that money savings.
And, engaging the community can be very hard. So you sort of touched on that a little bit in that answer. But like, what have you found to be the hardest kinds of behavior to influence, and some of the easiest ones as well?
Yeah. This is where understanding the behavior chain is really important. So those behaviors that are, I feel like, the hardest to change are those that have a lot of steps. So getting somebody to do, say, a rain garden project, or, an energy efficiency home improvement, where they've got to go through a lot of steps. They have to want to do it. They have to call a contractor. They have to make the appointment. The contractor has to come out. They need to make a decision about, what package, or what, if it's a landscape project, which way they want to go. Then they need to schedule the work, and then they need to, follow through and apply for any rebates. So there's a lot of different steps, and it's really easy to lose people along the way. So typically those types of behaviors can be really hard, as well as behaviors that there are just simply a lot of barriers to overcome. And sometimes those barriers are things that people don't have control over. So a lot of transportation behaviors, if the infrastructure isn't there, I want to carpool to work, but I live in a rural area and everyone lives really far away, or there are no buses, or that run at the time that I need to be at work. So those, with a lot of barriers as well. The easiest behaviors to change, or say that those are the one-time actions. One-time actions are pretty easy to change because you can use really strong tools like incentives or contests to push people to do this thing that's like one time. That might be, getting an energy efficient appliance, for example. So those tend to be a little bit easier, as well as those with lower barriers that have a lot of social approval associated with them. So picking up after pets is generally easier. Getting people to participate in cleanups, like litter cleanups, that type of thing. Those tend to be on the easier end of the spectrum.
On social norms, can you discuss short-term versus long-term behavior change? For the mask example, one might put their mask on if others do this in the moment, but not continue to use them or care in the future.
Yeah. So I can speak to that. We're learning more and more about the role of habits in behavior change. So yes, the social norms, people might do it, like, I'm going to do it in this context, so that, people don't perceive me as weird, but we want them to keep doing it, right, in other contexts. And so how do we form those habits? And one way, and something like mask wearing, which is a frequent behavior, there's a lot of opportunities for habit formation. But one of the ways in helping these behaviors to stick that shows a lot of promise is tying it to people's identity. So if people can perceive themselves as, I'm the type of person that wears a mask to protect others, they're more likely to do it in other contexts. And that's true of environmental behaviors as well. And we can link together different environmental behaviors, because if people, we're calling them out, say, you've already done all of these energy efficient home improvements, you're the kind of person who cares about the environment, and show them the association with maybe other water quality protection measures they can take on their property, because that's in line with their identity and how they see themselves. That seems to be a really good way for helping those social norms to stick across different contexts, because that identity sort of goes, whereas context can really change behavior in terms of habits.
We did have a comment that it is often hard for people to understand the concept of how their individual actions affect, for instance, the watershed as a whole. Do you have tips on how to balance the outreach and communication pieces?
Yeah, that comes up a lot. I mean, here in San Diego County, I've been working with the County of San Diego for like 15 years, and they've been, educating people. They want everyone to know that they live in a watershed and that their actions impact the watershed. And it's an important knowledge goal for the program. But what we find is that simply knowing that does not translate into behavior. So knowing that you live in a watershed, understanding that my actions impact the watershed doesn't overcome the other barriers. So I think it's important to educate about that concept over and over and over again and consistently, and show people with vivid imagery. I mean, for some of our clients, we've developed these, really kind of flashy infographics that are kind of fun to show people these really, technical concepts of how a watershed works. But I think that needs to be, that's only that one piece. So that's the wavy lines. That's the motivation. Oh, okay, I understand that. I'm motivated, but now you want me to, use organic pesticides or non-toxic pesticides. Well, that doesn't solve my ant problem, so I'm not going to do it. So there's other barriers are in the way that need to be addressed at the same time. And again, those barriers are different by behavior. So it's not ever just one message, or if they just get this one concept, they're going to do the behavior. We really have to address those other underlying barriers at the same time. But yeah, it's hard for people to understand that. Even people who are in it, it's sometimes hard to understand.
Well, there was one other question. I know we're at 3:31. So, but have you worked on plastic reduction and styrofoam campaigns?
Yeah, actually, yes. We're working on a couple right now, not styrofoam specifically, but plastic reduction. And again, that's kind of the same thing. Like plastic isn't plastic. We use plastic in different ways. And so with this particular program I'm working on with an aquarium up in Oregon, it's focused specifically on youth. And so what do youth actually have control over when it comes to plastic, and what are the most impactful behaviors? Because barriers to taking reusable utensils when you go out for fast food are going to be different than barriers to turning away single-use plastic bottles and using reusable bottles, which are different than the barriers to taking reusable shopping bags. So we really start by looking for what are the biggest opportunities in terms of plastic. So what plastic is winding up in the waterway? Is it bags? Is it cutlery, utensils? Is it, something else? And then what are the behaviors associated with that? So yes, that's typically how we are addressing it. It might be like fishing line. Fishing line's a big one. And one of my employees in her previous job with the Houston Zoo did a really interesting project associated with disposing of fishing lines on fishing piers. That was a huge impact on plastic. So still requires narrowing it down to specific behaviors.
Jennifer, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and the Q&A.